Hello.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hello.
Rachel,
Oh, hey, Rachel. How's it going?
I'm good. Just checking in.
Excellent. Hi, Leia. Was it easier to sign in this time?
Yeah, for me, I just clicked on the link, so.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think I set it up. No need to be admitted. No need to register. I had a talk this week where there were like 90 people, and I'd accidentally set it with a waiting room.
Hi,
And so
Jonathan.
people had to I had to click admit in order to get in, and it was a disaster. Like throughout the talk, people were continually coming in. Hi, Susan. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Hi, Leia.
Hi.
Hi. Was it easier for everybody to sign in today?
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent.
Much easier.
I am.
Yeah.
Last week. Yeah, but getting the hang of it. I was just saying that I gave a talk where it was for a congregation in New Jersey, and there were something like 90 people who had joined, and throughout people were signing off and logging back in, but I had accidentally set it so that the host had to admit people one by one. So throughout, I was getting
wow.
requests.
Oh, no.
Yeah, we're gonna do things all the time.
Well, you know, they had that Stephen Sondheim birthday special on Sunday, and you could not get into it. I don't know if they were using Zoom. And then when you finally could get into it about an hour later, the voice and the voices and the pictures weren't synchronized.
Really?
Then the Times gave it a good review. I wanted to say, what were you watching? Not to say the last watch.
Okay, that's the teacher. Okay.
Oh my, that is so funny.
But the Met did it and it worked really well.
It did.
Yeah, the Metropolitan Opera one worked really well. 4 hours.
Wow, and how many
They
people
had
were
all the
on?
great singers coming from all around the world, and the orchestra, and of course, doing pieces together.
Oh, that is amazing. Amazing. Hi, Luana.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. How are you?
Doing well.
Excellent. It was smooth sailing signing in today?
Yeah, not a problem.
Good, good, good. Excellent. All right. Slowly, slowly getting there. Excellent. This week we're going to do the old city of Jaffa.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll wait a few more minutes. Give everyone else an opportunity to join. Oh, Susan, did you get my email? I tried to respond to the email that you
Yes.
sent from, and it didn't. It bounced back.
Okay.
So that's
I
why
did that,
I had Rachel at the 92nd Street Y send it by way of them. I'm going to type in my email once again in chat, just in case if anything comes up during the week or at any time anyone wants to be in touch, you can feel free. But yeah, Susan, do you know why it might not have worked when I just hit reply and it bounced back?
Yeah, I don't know why it didn't work. And I should have investigated it more, but I didn't. I cannot tell a lie.
Once you're done.
And I'm also thinking, I'm wondering what I did with it. You gave us a list of what you were going to talk about too.
Yeah.
Oh yes, and I have it at the end of this one, but I can actually, while we're waiting, I'll send it over in the chat right now.
You can sit. You want to stand? Okay, stand.
I don't know what I did with it.
Okay, well, I just sent it in the chat.
And so when it's in the chat, can we print it out?
That's a good question. I am not
I
sure.
don't know. We can copy it though and maybe make a,
Yeah, you can copy it.
and
It
then
looks
put it-
like on mine, I don't know if this is a host feature, but on mine underneath the chat, it says file to the bottom right of the chat box.
okay.
So if you click on that, I think you can save it to your
Oh,
computer.
wow. Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah, try that and see. Well, after you do that, just check to make sure it's actually there.
Oh, it doesn't have the file name.
Ah,
It doesn't say,
welcome. It doesn't say the file name?
no.
Well,
But it does take you to your files, which is interesting, but it doesn't say what type of file it is
oh, that is interesting.
or the file name. But it definitely takes
More. Go to more. Because I got it. I put, I typed in more.
under the,
There's 3 little dots are, it says more there. And
okay,
then it says to, I saved it to my save chat. And then it says show in file, chat saved.
okay.
And it's on my PC documents.
Where's
And then
the-
it shows it.
Okay, while you're doing that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. So that ready for presentation. Okay. Presenter view. Okay. Oh, let me go to the first slide. Can you see me as well as the
Yes,
PowerPoint?
in a little box over to the right.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. That's great. That's exactly as I intended it. Perfect. So let's get started. Last week, we did a broad introduction into the field of biblical archaeology. And what we'll do subsequently is we'll go to different sites in the land of Israel, and we will parse the sites in a variety of ways. But through the archaeology, we'll also do the broad history, both ancient and modern. And this week we'll start with the old city of Jaffa, which was traditionally the gateway into the Holy Land. For thousands of years, pilgrims and conquerors entered the country by way of the port of Jaffa. And today we have a view from the port looking out over the city of sandstone. It is absolutely stunning. Was known as the Belle of the Sea in the 19th century. And today it is part of the modern city of Tel Aviv, ironically, because Tel Aviv actually grew out of the ancient city of Jaffa. So in 1909, Tel Aviv was founded to be a European-style garden suburb outside of the port city of Jaffa, and ultimately a series of events of the 20th century that we'll talk about a little bit later would bring it to be the dominant player in the region. And today, the official name of Tel Aviv is Tel Aviv Yafo, the Hebrew name of Jaffa.
New
Yeah.
Jersey.
Say it again. Oh, actually, you know what? Maybe I will, let me, I think I'll mute all in the beginning. And if you have questions along the way, you can send chats. And then I'll stop periodically. Oh, I had this problem before. I think I have to stop sharing my screen in order to mute. But, oh, I can do it one by one. Okay. Excellent. But feel free to share throughout, but now you can feel comfortable at home. Everyone is muted, and I'll unmute periodically so we can ask questions, but also along the way, you can feel free to send chats. Oops. Okay, so before we get into the history of Jaffa, I wanted to do a little bit about the region. So the Fertile Crescent, we're talking about the dawn of Western civilization and the crescent-shaped region from the Nile in Egypt. I'm going to use my cursor. Along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and then towards the east in the Tigris and Euphrates is where Western civilization will develop. About 5,000 to 6,000 years ago with the dawn of agriculture. Now, the primary civilizations will develop by the major rivers of the region. We have the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia and the Nile in Egypt. And to have these major rivers, it would yield governments that had a strong central authority in order to build large public works to develop the river water for irrigation purposes. And that's why Egypt will grow as a major empire, as well as a series of empires between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The land of Israel is in the crossroads between these two great empires. And so whoever was the dominant empire between Mesopotamia or Egypt would often expand and conquer the trade roads where Israel is. And the local civilization in the land of Israel before the Israelites come is known in the Bible as Canaan in Hebrew or Canaan in English. And Canaan would evolve because they don't have a dominant river. We do see the Jordan River where my cursor is, but the Jordan River today is a stream by American standards. You look at the Hudson, and the Hudson is a river. Then you look at the Jordan River, and it is really tiny. Would be very easy to get across without any special equipment, just dipping in, swimming 15 feet across and getting out the other side. So it was not the kind of river that would yield a major centralized authority. Most of the water source in the land of Israel is local individual springs. And the governments that would yield are individual city-states, because you could have individual communities that were completely independent of others and didn't necessitate coordinated efforts like major irrigation along rivers would require. And now to continue into a more localized, the geography of the land of Israel, we'll just go through some of the regions. This is a topographical map. And the major corridor in the country are the coastal plains. I'm running my cursor along a dotted line in the topographical map. This was known in the Bible as Derech Hayam. In Latin, in Roman period, was Via Maris, or in English, the Way of the Sea. And this was the dominant route between Egypt and Mesopotamia for both traders as well as conquerors, that has always played an instrumental role in the history of the country, including today. So in the Bible, where we look at where settlements were established and where battles took place, it's very much taking the geography in mind. And that's including Israel's War of Independence in 1948, where the major roads were. It's all delineated by the natural geography. So for instance, we can see the coastal plains is disconnected by the Jezreel Valley, this green area. Oh, so the map is a little bit confusing because north is this way. This is north, and I'm moving my cursor towards the south. Is that a weird diagonal? It's helpful for showing the topography, but it's not helpful for understanding the directional orientation. The west, basically these arrows here are delineating west to east. So north-south, the easiest way to get across the country is the coastal plains. East-west, up in the north, is the Jezreel Valley to get across. So whoever controlled these mountain passes really controlled much of the country. And next week, we're going to talk about a site called Megiddo. So we'll talk about this again, because Megiddo is right on the ridge here that dominates one of the two narrow roads. You could bring armies easily up the coast and avoid other sites. But once you were getting to these narrow valley passes, sometimes you could only get a couple of soldiers across side by side. And so a small, strong fortification could really dominate the region. And Jaffa is right here. This says in Hebrew Tel Aviv, because this is a modern map, but Jaffa is part of Tel Aviv. It's right here. And it makes sense. It's along the coast. The road to Jerusalem is along this stream is actually a dry riverbed. So most of the year it's dry, it's a dry valley, and then there are flash floods when it rains in the mountains a couple times a year. And then you would use this valley right here to get to Jerusalem. And this is Jerusalem in Hebrew, Yerushalayim, right there. And actually this green area here is the modern green line that delineates where the West Bank is. So you can see in 1948, the Israelis focused on making sure to have this corridor be part of what would be the newborn state of Israel, to make sure Jerusalem was connected to the rest of the country. Much of it is along the coast. So we have the coastal plains. These foothills are known as the Shfela in Hebrew. These were the borderlands traditionally between the Israelite kingdom and the Philistines of Goliath. And then the mountain region here is where much of the book of Genesis takes place. So we have Jerusalem in the center. And if you notice, there's a path, a white path on the top of the ridgeline. That's today called Derech Avot in Hebrew, or the Way of the Patriarchs. So this was where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel would really spend a lot of their time when they were in the Holy Land. And south of Jerusalem, we get to Bethlehem, where King David was from and where Jesus would be born around in the year 0. Down here is Hebron, which is where the matriarchs and patriarchs have their tomb where they were laid to rest. But this would not have been very practical for travel purposes. So if you're Egypt and you want to conquer the country, you don't really have to worry too much about this area. As long as you can control the coast and these narrow passes, you can really control the country without worrying about these individual city-states up there. And then further to the east, we have the large body of water is the Dead Sea. The stream that connects to the Dead Sea is the Jordan River. And the north part is the Sea of Galilee, or in Hebrew, the Kinneret, Israel's most important freshwater resource. And this valley here is critical. That is a Great Rift Valley. If you have been to safari in East Africa, in Kenya, Tanzania, and you've gone through the Rift Valley down there, it's the same Rift Valley. The massive tectonic plates that divide Africa and Asia is part of this valley, and it will continue from the Dead Sea along the border between Jordan and Israel, through the Red Sea, then cut across Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, all the way down to Mozambique. And it's this massive rift valley that allowed prehistoric humans to leave Africa, and this was the route they took. And also there's a major earthquake in this valley by Israel once every 100 years. The most recent one was in 1927. So Israel is pretty due for a significant earthquake. And it's also why the mountains go north-south. They're parallel to that rift. And also on the far side, on the eastern side, this is Jordan today. And the gray area here, it's gray because there, 20,000 years ago, there's a lot of volcanic activity. That's the Golan Heights, which was part of Syria between 1948 and 1967. And then Israel conquered it in 1967, fought another major war in the Yom Kippur War in 1973 with Syria. And since then, it's been very, very quiet, but incredibly strategic, because whoever controls that area can see what's going on in all of southern Syria. And conversely, when the Syrians had it, you could see what was going on in all of northern Israel. And so Jaffa, down here where the cursor is, was the port of Jerusalem. And on foot in ancient times, it would have been about a 2-day journey from Jaffa to Jerusalem. But to access the country from the Mediterranean, throughout most of history, Jaffa was the place that you would access it from. And actually, I'm going to unmute everybody to see if there are any questions about the geography before we move forward. All new participants will be muted. Okay. I just want to do a quick, okay, there, I unmuted all. And I wanted to just give you an opportunity, if anybody had questions about geography before we zoned in on Jaffa.
Is the Sea of Galilee saltwater?
No, the Sea of Galilee is freshwater. That's a great question. And today it's about 1/3 of Israel's water resources. And Israel has a national water carrier. Israel's small enough, and water is critical enough in the region, that it's all the federal government in Israel that controls all of the water systems. And so Israel is known to be the most efficient country with its water use. In fact, it recycles 80% of its sewage water, and it will reuse it as gray water for agriculture. They say that it's good enough to be used as drinking water. However, the association, people wouldn't want to drink recycled sewage water, so they use it for agriculture. So yeah, the Sea of Galilee is freshwater. The Jordan River is freshwater. And then the Dead Sea is 10 times saltier than a normal ocean.
Hmm.
So really briefly, 200 million years ago, in the days of the dinosaurs and Pangea, when all the continents were together as one, Israel was underwater. And the Dead Sea is a little piece of an ancient ocean that got stuck inland as the continents were shifting and the mountains were growing. It gets caught inland, and it's also the lowest place on the surface of the earth in the desert. And so as the Dead Sea evaporates, the amount of salt is the same, but the water gets more and more concentrated with salt. Any other questions about the
Really
topography? Okay, excellent. So
Actually,
then-
could you point out where the West Bank is?
yes, yes. So the West Bank is this green line.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, and it snakes in and goes around Jerusalem. It actually goes straight through Jerusalem, which is one of the things that makes it so complicated to find a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Wow.
And the reason it's called the Green Line is because in 1949, when they were drawing the map, and there were negotiations, armistice negotiations. So the negotiations were just to end the fighting, not a formal peace treaty and recognition of borders. So whoever controlled what continued to control them, and they used the green pen at the meetings. And so now it's called the Green Line. It goes right through Jerusalem. So in some places in Jerusalem, there are little alleyways that were the old border. And so the border can't go back to exactly what it was before 1967, and then to negotiate how they should change opens up a whole other can of worms. And today it's such a low priority now because the world has changed so dramatically since the very active negotiations in the 90s. So, but most of the sites of the book of Genesis are in the West Bank, which is why for Israel, they are so emotional. That all these sacred sites from the Bible.
That's really helpful.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so now I am going to mute everybody again. And we are going to continue. Let me just see if I can do full screen. Perfect. Okay. So now I have a map that's further zoomed in on just the region of Jaffa. And I'm moving my cursor to Jaffa, the port city. It's right on the Mediterranean. And if you notice, to the north is sea, to the west is sea. So the only way to conquer it is from the east or from the south. So Jaffa makes a tremendous amount of sense defensively as a site. It is not a great natural port. However, the positioning is absolutely wonderful. It's also on a little hill over there. This is a relatively modern map from the late 1800s. And we can see the green area over here are all orange groves. Outside of the Bible, the biggest association for Jaffa for much of the world for the last 500 years was Jaffa oranges. And today, those groves have been turned into real estate. That's prime real estate in Tel Aviv today. So the label Jaffa oranges, when you buy Jaffa oranges in the store, they're most likely oranges from anywhere in Israel. It's become a brand rather than the actual location. And up here are all sand dunes. And that's where Tel Aviv was founded, as a neighborhood of Jaffa. And this dark line right here is the road going to Jerusalem. So you would have taken 2 days along this. And this is how Richard the Lionheart during the Crusades went to Jerusalem. This is how Theodore Herzl in 1898 goes to Jerusalem. This is how David Ben-Gurion, who will become the first prime minister of Israel in the early 20th century, it's how he goes from Jaffa to Jerusalem. So now, while we're doing a broad macro view, we're going to talk about the chronology. And I can email this to anyone who wants it, or you can take a screenshot. I'm also happy afterwards, if there's interest, to send out a link to the presentation so that we can look over anything of interest that we wanted to review. For Jaffa's history, Jaffa is the oldest known port city on Earth. And it goes back, the earliest remains of permanent human habitation go back to 5000 BCE, or about 7,000 years ago. Then I chose 3600 BCE to start the Canaanite period because that's when the Bronze Age will begin. The Bronze Age is going to last 2,500 years. So it is a huge amount of time. And at the end of the Bronze Age, in 1500 BCE, the Egyptians will conquer Jaffa, and much of the country will be controlled by the Egyptians. And then 1200 BCE is usually the dating given to Joshua. Joshua, at the very end of Deuteronomy, at the end of the 5 books of Moses, Moses dies. Joshua will become leader of the Israelites, and he's the one who is going to lead the conquest of the Promised Land. We don't have any outside evidence that Joshua existed, so fitting him into biblical chronology, he can be anywhere between 1200 BCE and 1440 BCE, a pretty huge time frame. I would say most secular students of the Bible will say it's closer to 1200 BCE and use Joshua as the transition between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And the names of those time periods are based on what kind of tools were being used. So before the Bronze Age, there's a Chalcolithic Age, which is a reference to copper. Before that, the Stone Age. Then bronze tools, 1200 BC is around iron tools. And from Joshua through the book of Judges, there'll be no centralized government. And in 1000 BCE, roughly, is where we date King David to. And we have a single monarchy for the entire country. And after Solomon passes away, Solomon is David's son. After Solomon passes away, the northern 10 tribes of Israel will break off because they say taxes are too high. And Solomon's son, when they appeal to him to reduce taxes and the forced labor that individuals had to give, he said, if you thought my father was tough, just wait till you see me. And they break off, and you have the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And Jaffa will primarily fall in the southern kingdom of Judah. In 721 BCE, the Assyrians come out of Mesopotamia by way of the north of the country, and they destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. And the 10 tribes of Israel are lost to history. And the kingdom of Judah remains with its capital, Jerusalem. Until 586 BCE, the kingdom of Judah is destroyed, as is Jerusalem, the capital. And Solomon's temple, which was built in around 950 BCE, is destroyed. And it's destroyed by the Babylonians. But the Babylonians will be short-lived. And in 536 BCE, the Persians will defeat the Babylonians, invite the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, ushering in the Second Temple period. And this is the time period of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Bible, as well as the book of Esther and the story for Purim. Persians will rule for 200 years until Alexander the Great comes through in 332 BCE. Alexander dies without any successors, so his generals fight a series of civil wars. And the country will fall under the Egyptian Greeks, who were the Ptolemies. Until in the year 200 BCE, there's a war between the Egyptian Greeks and the Syrian Greeks. The Syrian Greeks conquer the country, and that sets the stage for the Hanukkah story. In 165 BCE, the Maccabees will rebel against the Syrian Greeks, rule for about 100 years until Pompey, who was an ally and then foe of Julius Caesar, he will annex the country in 63 BCE to Rome. So the country will retain a Jewish king, but under the Romans, until in the year 70, now we're switching into CE or AD. We're switching into the Common Era. The Jews will rebel against the Romans, and the Romans destroy Judea, Jerusalem, as well as the Second Temple. And the Western Wall is part of the complex of the Second Temple destroyed at that time. It will remain a pagan Roman city from the destruction in 70 until the year 325, when Constantine will convert the Roman Empire from paganism to Christianity. And it will be a Christian city until the year 638, where the Arab Empire, with the newborn religion of Islam, will come out of Arabia and conquer much of the Byzantine Empire and much of the Persian Empire. And in 638, Jerusalem is handed over to the victorious Arab armies. And the Arabs will rule the country until 1099, when the Crusaders will come out of Europe. And they will make the country Christian once again. And then in 1291 is the date of the end of the Crusader period. And there are two different Islamic dynasties that will rule from 1291 to 1516, a dynasty called the Mamelukes. And a dynasty is the wrong word, because Mameluke means owned. So these were warrior slaves that in their youth, they were born in slave markets in the Caucasus Mountains and sort of the border regions between Turkey and Russia. And when they were 10 years old, they would be purchased on the slave market. They would be trained their entire lives for the sole purpose of being warriors. And then the general would basically become the next ruler. And instead of leaving the throne to his children, he would leave it to the next general. Until in 1516, the Ottomans will come out of modern-day Turkey and conquer the region. Shortly after, they will build the current walls around the city of Jerusalem, and they rule for 400 years until the British in World War I will conquer the country. And the British will be there until 1948. And at that time, we have Israel's War of Independence, and Israel is born as a modern state. So in the 20th century, this is a Jewish painter from Romania. He moved to Tel Aviv in the 1920s. And this is his painting of the orange groves near Jaffa. Now, his name is Reuben because he wrote his name next in Hebrew and in English next to each other. So his last name is something very Slavic, but he goes by Reuben because that's how it appears on all of his paintings. But we can see this beautiful sort of peaceful area, lush gardens. And they say that in the dawn of the 20th century, before you could even see the city, if you were coming by sea, you would smell the oranges already. But going into the modern history of Jaffa, Jaffa is destroyed by Napoleon in 1799. When Napoleon is a general, but he is not yet the emperor of France. And this is the outside of Jaffa. We can see it's a pretty bustling market, orange sellers, but it also looks pretty old world. And up until 1869, when the Suez Canal was built, Jaffa would have been relatively quiet. This arched building right here, it's a gateway, and this is the rest of the building. That was the Kishla, the Turkish fortress. That, just a fun fact, in 1948, when Israel conquers the country, it becomes an Israeli prison. And in 1960, when Israel captures Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, he was a Nazi who escaped from Europe, rebuilt his life under an assumed name in Argentina. And before they made public that they had found him and were bringing him to justice, he was imprisoned in this building in 1960. But going back to the 19th century, Jaffa is seeing a boom with the building of the Suez Canal. And this is the same area, but now it has a clock tower. In 1901, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who was ruling in Constantinople, he's celebrating the 25th anniversary of his reign. He builds 100 clock towers around the Ottoman Empire to celebrate his reign and to bring the empire into modernity. And this clearly says that Jaffa is top 100 cities of the Ottoman Empire. And here's a view from the sea. Jaffa is not ideal as a modern port. It is very, very rocky. We can see that the city is built on a hill, so in terms of defense, it's a great position. But for a port, not ideal, and this is from the other view, we can see steamships would have to park outside the port, and small port rowboats rowed out by porters would come. They would collect people and luggage off of the ships. And in stormy weather, this could be quite traumatic. A lot of early Zionists who were coming into the country in the beginning of the 20th century remember that it was stormy waters, and they would see their life savings that were in a trunk go overboard and slowly sink as they were finally approaching the destination they had dreamed of rebuilding their lives in. So this is an aerial view from the Royal Air Force in 1936. The British had conquered the country in 1917. And we can see it's a very densely populated city. And in 1936, the Arabs rebel against British rule and also Jewish immigration into the country. And so the British see this city as a huge security hazard because a sniper could fire down and then get lost in the alleyways. So the British, in June of 1936, they dropped leaflets saying, evacuate your homes. We are going to make a 10-meter, 30-foot wide security road in the city. And this is the Royal Air Force while they were going through and dynamiting their way through the city. And then the last one, we can see a road of rubble that was made. So if you follow my cursor, this is the British in order to maintain order during a rebellion. And they called it Operation Anchor because the avenue that they blew up was the shape of an anchor. And for archaeologists, this was convenient because in a continuously inhabited city, it's hard to know what secrets lie beneath. However, archaeologists are going to start digging in areas that were cleared. That's one of the reasons that we can date Jaffa to being the oldest known port city on Earth, because with all of this destruction, there is the opportunity to dig underneath the surface. So it would have been incredibly, incredibly chaotic for the population in the 30s. And then more so, there was a major battle in 1948 in Israel's War of Independence, during which those who could leave left during the battle. Now, for the Jews, it's right after the Holocaust. There's really nowhere else to go. For the Arabs of Jaffa, they will mostly leave by the sea in small boats, thinking they would come back after the battle. And the Jews win the battle. It becomes part of the newborn state of Israel. And there are, and this was one of the major cities of Palestine before Israel is born. So a lot of Palestinian refugees can trace their lineage back to Jaffa. So today, Jaffa has become an art colony. And this is kind of the gateway into the new city of Jaffa. It's an Israeli artist called Ron Marine, who in 1993 built a suspended orange tree. So this is supposed to be a fake orange seed. And out of it is growing a real live orange tree. And it's hanging from the buildings, and there is a small wire that we can't see in this picture that's irrigating the tree. So it's the entrance to an art colony, but it's also a city that's been severed from its roots from a traumatic 20th century. And today, all of those orange groves that were traditionally associated with Jaffa, it's all real estate now. So again, if you buy an orange that was grown on a kibbutz 100 miles away from Jaffa, as long as it's in Israel, it could still be labeled Jaffa orange today. But let's go to the finds. So this is in the Israel Museum right now. Sadly, the Israel Museum, like museums all over the world, is currently closed, but they had just done a lovely temporary exhibit called Pharaoh in Canaan, or Canaan. And if you look at this gate, you can see the stones that are rough are the original stones that contain hieroglyphics. And they were found in part of that area where the city was destroyed to make way for the security vehicles. And we can see clearly in the hieroglyphics, or the archaeologists can identify clearly in the hieroglyphics, that this was referencing Ramses II. Roughly 1200 BCE, oftentimes he is considered to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. Time-wise, it makes sense as to where we want to date the Exodus. It says specifically in the book of Exodus that the Hebrew slaves built two different cities, one called Pithom and the other was called Ramses. And this is Ramses II, so perhaps it was named after him or his father. We don't know for sure, but an exciting connection to think of this figure that we associate with the Exodus ruling over part of what will become the land of Israel. And now you'll notice that the rest of the filling in is all modern. And so the hieroglyphics are based on assumptions. We have a tremendous amount of artifacts from Ramses II that survived in Egypt. So the rest of the hieroglyphics is assumed based on his name and titles and what we find in Egypt to compare it to. But it's a lot of conjecture, and future archaeologists, you can't question the originals that were found, but these areas that are filled in for our benefit to look at, even though they didn't find it, maybe future archaeologists will say, you know what, that doesn't look right. It was probably something like this. Or there could be a future find. They recently renewed excavations in Jaffa. This is a replica in the area where they were excavating. And in this tell is an artificial mound, an archaeological mound. They found a tremendous number of strata, levels of archaeology. So just to go through that again, the tell and strata. Tell is an artificial mound, and the earliest is on the bottom of our page. We have a city. The city gets destroyed, and the new rulers will fill it in, build a city on top. Then that city gets destroyed, and new rulers will fill that in on top. And then slowly, the sands of time cover the whole thing, so it looks like a hill, but a kind of artificial hill, oddly symmetrical. And here is modern time archaeologists on top with all these treasures to be discovered underfoot. And now, rarely do things lay out so nice and evenly. And then you also have the problem that in a site like this, there's a huge mishmash because a lot of the stones get reused. In fact, the stones with the hieroglyphics that have been identified as a gate, they were not found right in that spot, but they were actually reused by a later civilization as stones of part of the city walls. But let's look, this is a virtual reality presentation of how those stones would have been used originally. And if you look down at the bottom of the page, this white area are the hieroglyphics. So along the gate that was entering into the gateway to Egyptian Jaffa. And again, Ramses dates to about 1200 BCE. We have tremendous finds of Ramses II. He was a prolific builder. He's reigning at one of the high points in Egyptian history. And this is his tomb down in Abu Simbel, where you have massive figures of Ramses II. And it was actually his son. Last week, we saw the first mention of Israel outside of the Bible on what was known as the Merneptah stela. And in the stela, it's an inscription that says that he wiped out Israel. Merneptah is the son of Ramses II. So Ramses II, according to the archaeology, we understand he was ruling over Jaffa towards the end of Egyptian rule over Jaffa. Shortly after Ramses dies, the Egyptian empire is going to contract. And the origins of the Egyptian conquest go back to about 1500 BCE. This papyrus is known as the Harris Papyrus 500. And it is today in the British Museum. And it tells the tale of the Egyptians' conquest of Jaffa. So roughly 1500 BCE, there was an Egyptian pharaoh called Thutmose III. And Thutmose III is reigning at another high point in Egyptian history. So he's marching out to conquer the trade routes and the crossroads between his empire and Mesopotamia. And Jaffa was so well fortified, and you can't conquer it without a navy from the sea. So the papyrus tells us that he tells his general Jehuti, figure out a way to conquer the city. And Jehuti says, give me 200 soldiers, give me 100 gift baskets, and give me your scepter, and I'm going to go and I'll figure out how to conquer it. So Jehuti goes with the baskets, a few soldiers, the royal scepter, knocks on the gate of the city-state of Jaffa and says, I have Pharaoh's scepter. I've betrayed him. If you let me in, together we can plot to conquer all of Egypt. And the prince of Jaffa is skeptical, says, camp outside. And Jehuti says, well, let me throw a feast in your honor. So the prince of Jaffa and the noblemen come out to Jehuti's tent. They have a great feast. Jehuti takes the prince into a back room, and when they're alone, hits him over the head with the scepter, chains him up so he can't escape. And he comes out and he says, the prince said to bring in the gift baskets, and inside the gift baskets were hiding soldiers. So they conquer the city from the inside out. And it's very similar to the Trojan horse story, but this papyrus dates to before Homer. So is this an accurate telling? Is it an Egyptian folk tale that they would tell to their children? We don't know exactly. But we have this ancient artifact that describes the conquest of Jaffa in roughly 1500 BCE, and the Egyptians will control the country for about 300 years. This is Thutmose, an image from a sculpture of his that's in the Met today. And one of my favorite things in the Met is that they also have his toe rings of Thutmose III. So these are golden toe rings. They only found 9 of them. But we can see that clearly Egypt was incredibly wealthy at the time of his reign when they conquered Jaffa. Oh, and this is just a map that shows, again, you can't conquer the city from the north and the west, only from the south and the east, which makes sense why Jehuti would have looked for an alternative way to conquer it. So our next major find, we find the skull of a lioness in roughly around the year 1200 BCE. So it's right around the time of Ramses II. And there's not a whole lot of pottery around. And this is a bit problematic because it's a transitional moment in the history. Shortly after Ramses II, we have a destruction layer, and we have evidence that there was a short-lived Canaanite period followed by a Philistine period. So originally, Jacob Kaplan, who excavated the site, and he's the one who finds the skull of the lioness, he says this must have been a temple to a lion cult, a pagan temple for a lion cult, and this is representative of a sacrifice. And it's possible, but to find only one skull, it's a pretty big leap to say that definitively. So they did not find enough. It's a bit confusing because it's found at a transitional point where it could really fall into the Egyptian period, the Canaanite period, or the Philistine period. So we don't know a whole lot about the context. Last week we talked a little bit about how modern Israel is so utilizes archaeology so much. So this was a stamp, an Israeli postage stamp with an image of the find of the lioness's skull. And now jumping ahead in the Greek period, we find coinage dating to Ptolemy the Fourth. So the first Ptolemy was one of Alexander the Great's generals. Alexander dies, he's still young, he does not have a child who's going to succeed him. So his generals fight over the massive empire he leaves behind. The general Ptolemy will take over Egypt and rule from Alexandria. And he also controls the land of Israel. Ptolemy the Fourth is one of the last of his descendants that will retain control over the land of Israel. He passes away in 204 BCE. In the year 200 BCE, there's a battle between the Ptolemies, who are Egyptian Greeks, and the Seleucids, who are Syrian Greeks. And the Syrian Greeks will win. And it's the Seleucid Empire that is going to be the villain of the Hanukkah story that the Maccabees are going to rebel against. But this is a coinage that is specifically from the Ptolemies, so we know it's just before that will take place. And going into the Hanukkah story, we have a few verses. You don't have to read the whole thing if you don't want, but I'll summarize that Judah Maccabee is rebelling against the Greeks. He is fighting mostly in the area near Jerusalem. And in Jaffa, it's a mixed city. It has both Greek pagans as well as Jews. And the Greek pagans, in reaction to Judah's successes by Jerusalem, are going to take all of their Jewish population, put them out to boats, burn the boats down and kill their Jewish population. And so Judah will come and he will attack Jaffa, but does not occupy it. He just comes and destroys it in vengeance. Shortly after Maccabees, we have, this is a picture of a modern church, but it commemorates an event from the New Testament. Peter, shortly in the book of Acts of the Apostles, so this is shortly after the execution of Jesus, Peter is going around and he is proselytizing, but the religion is still a sect within Judaism. And Peter goes to Jaffa, and he stays at the house of a guy named Simon the tanner, where he has a dream. And the dream is the angel Gabriel will lay out a sheet filled with non-kosher foods. Peter is Jewish born. He's still a practicing Jew. And initially, the early Christian community was entirely Jewish. However, in this dream, the angel offers him non-kosher food. So cheeseburgers, lobster, shrimp, the best forbidden foods. And Peter says, these are forbidden. And the angel offers a second time. He refuses again. He offers a third time. And he refuses a third time. And then the angel gets upset and says, who are you to say what God has made is unclean? And this is a major point in the early Christian community. From here, Peter is going to go and he's going to convert the centurion Cornelius, who's a Roman pagan, to the new Christian community. And that's going to be the first non-Jewish Christian. And so this really represents the parting of the ways between the newborn Christian faith and the Jewish community. And this church is one of very few Catholic churches that faces west, because they usually face towards the east, and this faces west because the focus is no longer on Judea, but on the larger Mediterranean world. It's also built on the Casbah, which was the main fortress of the city in 1799 when Napoleon comes. This is a painting that's in the Louvre, and it's of Napoleon visiting the plague-stricken in Jaffa. Dates to 1804. And this is a bit of Napoleonic propaganda. Napoleon comes, he conquers Jerusalem in 1799 in brutal fashion. In fact, he takes 4,000 Turkish soldiers as prisoners. He doesn't have what to do with them, so he has them executed in the sea. He continues north to try and conquer the rest of the country, and leaves a small garrison there. And when Napoleon turns back after a defeat at the hands of the British Navy and the Ottoman army in Akko, he comes and he discovers that his troops are suffering from the bubonic plague. And the story goes that he actually had an Armenian doctor who was a native of Jaffa euthanize them, so he didn't have to deal with them, and he could continue his retreat, so he could go back to Paris. And apparently the rumors were probably such that he felt the need to show himself touching the sick afterwards. So he's already emperor of Paris, and he's doing a bit of propaganda here. He commissions this piece of him visiting his plague-stricken soldiers. But for our purposes, recently they were doing work in a Jaffa flea market, and they found a cannon from several hundred years ago that they think possibly was a Napoleonic cannon. And this is like common road work. They were doing some infrastructural building in Jaffa. Jaffa is now being gentrified very, very rapidly. It's the hot place to live. It's kind of like Williamsburg in Brooklyn, that there's a tremendous amount of building going on. People are moving in, and 20 years ago, there were amazing deals to be had. You could build a beautiful new home on the Mediterranean for a very affordable price. And now it is already very expensive, but incredibly desirable. And this was just a very, very recent find within the last few years. And sorry that we're over time. I just have a couple of slides left. This is a find of an Arabic inscription dating to the Crusader period. And it says in the Arabic, 1229 of the incarnation of our Lord Jesus the Messiah. But it's in Arabic. We don't have any other Arabic inscriptions from the Crusader period that are Christian. So this was hiding in plain sight for a long time. They knew, they had found this. It was hanging up on a random wall in Tel Aviv. And finally, it took quite a long time to be identified as like, oh, this is actually a major find during the Crusader period. Frederick II was the Holy Roman Emperor in the 1220s. And he is one of few crusaders who does not conquer through war, but through negotiation. And he comes, there's a tremendous amount of fighting between different Islamic rulers at the time, and he negotiates a return of much of the coast, as well as part of Jerusalem, to Crusader hands. They will only remain in Crusader hands for about 15 years. And Jerusalem at that time was actually divided, where the holy Islamic sites stayed in Islamic hands, and the rest of the city was in Christian hands. However, that was short-lived. And I like to wrap up an exploration of Jaffa with, for whatever reason, it is a city of sea monsters. So on our left-hand side, we have the Jewish sea monster story from the Hebrew Bible. This is from the Sistine Chapel. That is Jonah the prophet about to be swallowed by the great fish. He gets a mission from God. He's the only prophet who gets a mission to prophesy to non-Jews. So he's told to go to the pagan city of Nineveh, which was the greatest city on earth at the time, and to tell them if they do not change their wicked ways, then the city will be smited. And he is terrified. He goes to Jaffa. He takes a ship, tries to escape from God, can't escape from God. So God sends a terrible storm. And the captain is like, I expected good weather. What's going on? Jaffa says, that's probably my bad. They throw him overboard. The sea's calm. He gets swallowed by the great fish, repents for 3 days, and then he's spit out to shore. And today in synagogues, this story is read every year for Yom Kippur, a classic story of repentance and forgiveness. And he actually does go to Nineveh. He prophesies, people change their ways, God saves the city where nothing happens, and then Jonah feels like an imposter, because how did the people know he was speaking the truth if nothing happened after they repented? So the Christian sea monster story, we have St. George in the year 300. George was a soldier in the Roman army from Lod, where the airport is in Israel today. And he is coming back on leave. He discovers that a dragon has nested over the local well. And the people had been offering up sheep to get the dragon to go, leave the well, eat the sheep. They would go fill up their water, and then they would do the same thing until there were no more sheep left. Said that they started to do that with young maidens. And then George comes and he says, how about I kill the dragon if I could marry the local princess? And they say, we hadn't thought about killing the dragon. So George will kill the dragon. Later on, he will be martyred in the last of the anti-Christian Roman persecutions, because this is just before Constantine. So he'll be executed as a Christian, and he is the patron saint of warriors in Catholicism and Greek Orthodoxy. And the last one is the pagan sea monster story of Andromeda, and this is from the Met. So this is Andromeda. The statue is from 1694 by an Italian sculptor called Domenico Guidi. It's in the European Sculpture Gallery. And her parents are King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia. And Cassiopeia is bragging that she and her daughter Andromeda are the most beautiful mortals on earth, even more beautiful than the sea nymphs. The sea nymphs are semi-divine creatures, and they say to Poseidon, the god of the sea, you have to teach these mortals a lesson. So he sends storms and a sea monster to flop its belly and to create tidal waves. The city can't function. They send an oracle to find out how to appease the gods. The oracle says, you have to chain up your daughter Andromeda to the rocks as an offering to the sea monster. So they do that. And the sea monster is slowly approaching Andromeda when Perseus, just having killed Medusa, is flying overhead, sees this beautiful woman chained to the rocks, about to be eaten by a sea monster. He goes straight to the royal palace and says, let me make you a deal. If I kill the sea monster, can I marry Andromeda? They say, good deal. And he gets there just in time because the sea monster is moving very, very slowly. And he kills the sea monster and pulls out Medusa's head so that the sea monster turns to stone. And this is an aerial view. You can see on the right-hand side where my cursor is, the long row of stones right there. That's the spine of the great sea monster that's about to get to Andromeda, whose rocks are just off the screen in this picture. But it does go to show that what a significant city Jaffa was, not only in the Jewish and Christian worlds, but also in the Greek world, if there was going to be such a pivotal piece of Greek mythology associated with it. So I am going to unmute everybody and take questions. I'm sorry that I went over time. Thank you, everyone. Next week will be 3 ancient cities. We're going to be going back 3,000 years to Megiddo, Hatzor, and Gezer. And we'll talk about, it says specifically in the book of Kings that Solomon fortified these 3 cities. And we're going to talk about that debate and how that is such a pivotal debate in archaeology generally in the land of Israel. So now, I'm trying to, okay, now I can unmute. Right. Okay. Excellent. Does anybody have questions?
Yeah, I do. It's Wendy. The last image you showed us, which was the spine, all of the rocks, that is not a naturally occurring formation, correct?
Right. Correct. So this, as it is, was actually done by the British. The British come into the country in 1917. And they have made promises all over the place during World War I. They promised Palestine to the Jews. They also promised it to the Arabs, and they also promised it to the French. They promised Arabia to both the Saudi family and the Hashemites. And basically, they were war expediency. They promised it all over the place. So when they come in, they're trying to honor as many of these promises as they can. And they, at the time, they're developing the country remarkably quickly. So they're the ones who build this, and the cement section on the left-hand side of that row of rocks is British. And yeah, they'll lay out the rocks like this. There always were a very rocky area there that were considered to be parts of the sea monster. I sort of utilize this because it's so convenient for the story. But yeah, so the classic association with the story is that the rocks around are part of the remains of the.
Right. Thanks. I have one other question, if I may. Just going back to the timeline for a second, not that we need to see it, but at what point is it surmised that the Torah is written?
Oh, that's a great question. So that I actually want to get it up for my benefit. So the Torah, Moses and Joshua are dated to anywhere between 1200 BCE to 1440. And the 1440 is because in the book of Kings, it says that Solomon built his temple 480 years after the Exodus. And so taking that timeline, we don't have any outside confirmation about Solomon, but we can date to his son. There's some outside confirmation about events that are described during his son's rule. So he's usually dated to 960 BCE. Anyway, if you assume that Moses wrote it, you would take that time frame. But if you go with the source theory that we talked about last week,
right,
the assumption that king who is believed to have commissioned much of it died in 609 BCE. So the Deuteronomic texts would have been late 7th century BCE, and the J and E sections, J being where they use the name of God as Jehovah, E where they use it as Elohim. Those two, the understanding is that they were two traditional narratives that when in 721 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed, refugees bring with them some of these traditions, and to unify the kingdom, probably also under King Josiah, who does the Deuteronomic texts, they sort of merge the two narratives. So a great example is when Joseph, in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, when he is thrown into a pit by his brothers. In one version, it says Reuben was the villain who leads the charge. In one, it says it was Judah. And so probably the version that Judah had is the kingdom of Judah. So Judah does not want to vilify their namesake. So they probably had it as Reuben. And the northern kingdom probably had it as Judah. And instead of sort of marrying the two stories, they actually have two versions side by side in the text.
Jonathan, in the book that I've been reading that I mentioned to you, The Prophets and Pharaohs.
Oh, yes.
He credits Ezra, a 6th century rabbi, with deciding to collect, reshape, and organize the books of the Old Testament into more or less present shape. And then he talked about the I can't ever say that word, Septuagint, when it was the first known translation of the Hebrew scripts into Greek, as taking place at 1285 BC.
Wait, 1285?
Yeah,
Are you
that
sure
was translated into Greek, though.
Right. But it was translated in 285 BCE, no?
Yeah, didn't I say it right? 285
Oh.
BC?
Sorry, I
I'm
thought
sorry.
I heard 12 and okay.
No, 285. I might have said it wrong.
Yeah, I might have heard it wrong. Excellent. Yes. So Ezra, yeah, the understanding is that he sort of canonized the text and was like the final editor of what of the text, particularly of the 5 books of Moses. He's also the person who started the Torah reading on Monday and Thursday mornings because they were market days. And so I think that the process would have been considered to be an ongoing process, and Ezra was the one who really canonized it and finalized it. And then in 285 BCE with the Septuagint, that is just after the, it's about 50 years after Alexander the Great. So you have the Greeks are ruling the region, and the Ptolemies are the ones who will build the great library in Alexandria. And they want to have translations of all the great works of literature into Greek. And there's a rabbinic story that says that 72 rabbis were all separated to translate the Torah individually, and word for word, it was exactly the same. And the purpose of that story is to lend authority to the final translation of the Septuagint. But we actually have a lot of issues with the translation between the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible.
Interesting.
Yeah. 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 Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Excellent.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. So again, in the notes, you have my email and upcoming lectures. So yeah, if there are any questions or anything that I'm particularly interested to do in coming weeks, we can absolutely focus on that. And yeah, we can be in touch.
Thank you
Great,
very
thank
much.
you.
This was
Thank
really
you.
great.
Excellent. Excellent.
I particularly love the map to see how the geography operated. That was fascinating.
Oh, good. I plan to do that every week.
Okay, that was really great.
Excellent. Excellent. Good. I'm glad that you enjoyed that. I'm glad that you enjoyed that. And yeah, I want to do that every week because I think it's so critical to understanding the sites.
Thank you.
Great.
Pleasure. Excellent. Have a wonderful week,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.